VOX animations have a very specific look. They never feel fully digital. There's always texture, slight imperfections, something a little analog running through everything. If you've ever tried recreating this style, you know there's lots of tutorials out there. Most of them will get you close, but they usually miss the smaller decisions that make VOX videos feel so high-end and documentary-like. In this video, I want to walk through the visual treatments VOX relies on and how they're built in After Effects. We'll start with a bit of context for where the style comes from, then we'll build a few of these techniques together. Let's run it. If you want to really be able to recreate their look, it helps us understand the visual mindset VOX is working from. Traditional news graphics tend to be very templated. Think a lot of 3D, flashy, computerized looking graphics.
More graphics, all right?
VOX went in the opposite direction. Their format walks the viewer through the messy source material that's a part of journalism. Think archival footage, charts, maps, articles, interviews, stuff coming from all over the place. Instead of trying to smooth that out, they leaned into it and established an art direction that's heavily analog. Basically, screens feel like screens, paper feels like paper, everything has this tactile element to it. Once you understand that, all the choices within After Effects feel pretty intuitive and make sense. If you think about it, everything in the world has some sort of material associated with it. To create a truly analog look, VOX introduces texture into their digital animation. That usually means sourcing something first. My favorite place to find texture is texturelabs.org. It's free, high res, and safe to use commercially. But the texture itself isn't the only important part. How you apply it and what actually makes sense for your design is equally as important. All right, let's take a look at this very basic VOX style composition that I put together. It looks kind of close, but let's walk through the process of texturing this so it feels more analog. The first thing I'm always going to do is I'm going to make sure there's no pure white visible in the background. And why you want to do this is think about a room with paper in it. Every room is going to have some sort of light temperature. It's either going to be warm or it's going to be cool. And your paper is always going to absorb that temperature. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to change this background to something a little bit warmer, not much. Just going to find a warm tone here. And then I might just knock it like maybe 4% to the right. The next thing that I'm noticing with this is those background lines are a little bit too sharp and clean and they look pretty computerized. So let's roughen them up a little bit. What we're gonna do is we're gonna apply a roughen edges effect. So we're gonna go over to here and just search for roughen edges. And they're almost disappeared there, and that's because the border size is way too big. So let's just dial that down to like something like 2. Let's go further, let's go to like 0.3. Already with that adjustment, it's starting to feel a lot better. Next thing I'm gonna wanna do is apply some sort of texture. Like I said, I like to pull these from Texture Labs, and I think with this animation, something like a halftone pattern would look pretty good because it will give you that newspaper cutout kind of feel. So I pulled this texture by searching halftone grunge in Texture Labs, and it gave me something that looks like this. So let me drop that in and let's scale it down since it's so high res. And then what I'm gonna do is, since it's got that 50% gray to it, we're going to want to use one of the overlay blend modes. So basically anything in this section, and I'm just going to select overlay. And already as is, if you zoom in, it's really got that nice newspaper-esque feel to it. And the other thing about switching that background color off of white, it's actually going to show up in the background very subtly, which is nice, and it'll never show up on pure white like it does over here. So that's just another reason to change your background color to some sort of color temperature. All right, this is looking pretty good already. Let's take it a step further. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add an adjustment layer over everything. Go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, and let's name this Chromatic Aberration and Vignetting. So first thing I'm gonna do is add chromatic aberration, and there's a free plugin called Quick Chromatic Aberration that I think works great, and it's not baked into After Effects like a standard effect, so highly recommend you getting that. Also, another thing you're gonna see me do throughout tutorials is I'm gonna pull up a shortcut like this, and it's just my effects panel, and I'm just gonna search for things. It's the same thing as something you would find over here in the effects and presets panel. It's just a quicker way of me getting to it. So if you look closely, it's a little bit of chromatic aberration happening, which I think is helping a lot. Maybe we want to dial that up to like 1.5. That might be too strong. I always get excited with this effect, and sometimes dialing it too much can look amateur. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull that back down to something like 0.8. I think that's exactly where I want to be. The next thing that I want to add is some vignetting, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to search for Lumetri color. And I'm going to take that, go down to the vignetting property and just scale that amount down till it looks kind of nice and guide your eye towards the middle of the composition. Great, this is looking pretty good. The last thing I might add is I found this light leak texture on Texture Labs. I think it might look nice if we put it over everything and just kind of discolored the paper a little bit. So let's add that on top and scale it down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that blend mode to something like add. Since it's kind of got a black background, you're going to want to use blend modes in this section. See, I like how that's interacting with the paper in the background and that newspaper cutout. It's just a little bit of discoloration. I think it makes this whole composition look a little bit more organic. The next thing is the obvious one, cutting on twos. This usually shows up as the posterized time effect and is covered in almost every VOX tutorial. But why it works comes from traditional animation. When everything was hand-drawn, to save time and money, they only drew every 2 frames. It gave animation this slightly choppy, handcrafted vibe. Once computers took over, everything got smoother. Keyframing and tweening were the new methods. Over time, that smoothness started to feel a little sterile. So what VOX does, and what you see in movies like Spider-Verse or Puss in Boots, is reintroduce some of that choppiness by limiting the frame rate. All right, let's go back to this comp that we created here. The last thing missing is just the posterized time effect that gets it that nice choppy frame rate. So we'll just add a layer, new, adjustment layer. We'll name it posterize, and we will add that effect onto it. So we'll go posterize time. And if we wanted to make this super collagey, we would turn this frame rate to 8. This would be technically cutting on 3s rather than cutting on 2s. Here's that set to 12. Super simple effect, but you'll probably want to add this on to every composition you create in this VOX style. When VOX shows articles or websites, they rarely feel like static screenshots. They usually add an adjustment layer with a stack of effects that emulate a computer monitor. Then animate the camera smoothly across the screen to guide your eye. The screen emulation and the camera movement I feel like helps you feel like you're kind of participating in the journalism and discovering things along with the narrator. So what we have here is just a basic screen recording, and we're going to apply a screen treatment to it. Let's create one that's easy and very repeatable and gets us that analog look we're going for. First things first, we're going to create an adjustment layer. So go to layer, new, adjustment layer. We'll just name this screen treatment. And what we're going to do is we're going to add an effect called Venetian blinds. So we're going to search that. Kind of creates this Venetian blinds like transition that erases your background. So the first thing is we don't want a transparent background to show. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to add the effect called solid composite. So we'll search that, solid composite. And I think I want to make that background black. I think for transition completion, the amount that I've found that works best is something like 5%. You can already see that we've got these nice vertical scan lines, but I think most monitors are horizontal. So we'll rotate this to something like 90. The next thing we want to do is compress these lines a bit. So let's make the width somewhere around 8. The last thing I'm going to do is add a feather to these edges so it's not as harsh. So something like 1. So it's already giving us a bit of a screen look, which I like. Now, if you want it to feel kind of like a pixel grid, like a laptop would be, you can just duplicate this effect and change the rotation to 180. But for this, let's just keep it horizontal. The next thing I'm going to add is a chromatic aberration. So we're going to use that same plugin, quick chromatic aberration. We can go a little bit heavier than the composition on this. So let's go to like 1.2. The next thing I'm going to add is I'm going to add a Lumetri color so we can get a nice vignette going. And we're just going to take that and we'll dial that back to guide your eye towards the center. Pro tip, if you want to get super analog with this, is you can add an exposure layer. And what you're going to do is you're going to hold the Option key and press on the stopwatch here for exposure. We're going to add an expression that is just wiggle 2408. And what this does is adds a bit of flicker and a refresh rate to your screen to make it ultra realistic. You can even dial it back if you want it to be a little bit smoother by adjusting this value. Now let's talk about archival footage. As a journalism outlet, VOX pulls stuff from everywhere. Archive.org, YouTube, phone footage, fair use clips. All these things usually look differently and have different qualities. Basically, nothing's gonna match. If you drop that straight into a timeline, the differences are pretty obvious and the cuts become jarring and take you out of the story. To fix that, what VOX does is run everything through a shared treatment. I call this footage homogenization. It could be as simple as forcing black and white, adding some heavy grain above everything. The real goal is just to make transitions feel less jarring. Some of those effects can help reinforce that analog feel on top of it. Let's build one together. All right, let's blend these 3 photos together. They're all taken from different photographers and they got a bit of a different look to them. This matters less about the effects you use, it's just more consistency across clips. So something I like to do is to add an adjustment layer with a blur, do fast box blur. Having the edges consistently blurred helps. The other thing it does is it guides your eye towards the middle. So I'm gonna do a fast box blur, which for the record is not always the best blur that you're going to want to use, but you can also use a camera lens blur, which typically looks nicer. It's just really render intensive. It might very well light your computer on fire, but it does look good if you got a very high-end computer. So what we're going to do, we're just going to add this blur radius and we'll dial it up to maybe 6. And then what you can do is you can just add a radial mask. And what we're going to do is we're just going to mask it out there. And we'll go into our mask settings and invert it, and then we will add some feathering so it's not just like a very hard circle. There we go. My eye feels drawn to the middle of the frame, which I like. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to add another adjustment layer for the rest of our effects. First effect I'm going to add is called CC ball action. Weird name. It almost creates this TV-like screen. So we're going to reduce the grid spacing down to 0. And that's pretty much it. And if you zoom in, you can see it's doing a little bit of work creating that pixelation. Next thing we're going to do is add some chromatic aberration, which we've done a lot of. I'm going to use that same plugin. We'll crank this up to something like 2. Our effects are already looking pretty good. The next thing we're going to add is an exposure flicker, and we'll hit stopwatch, and we'll do wiggle 24.05. So basically 24 times a second, it's going to wiggle by 0.05. And already our footage is starting to blend together nicely. The last thing I want to add is some heavy grain on top. So we'll just go into grain, add grain, and maybe make that size like 1.4. And we'll change this to final output so we can see it. On a total side note, I actually recorded a real CRT TV and created this emulation within After Effects that it's pretty plug and play when you really want to dial up that analog feel. This emulation and a few of my footage treatment presets are free and they're in my bio. Feel free to take a look or use them however you want. To wrap things up, what VOX is really doing here is they're making many small decisions that pull their graphics away from that digital synthetic feel. And that's only part of the picture. There's a lot more happening in how these videos are designed and structured, which I've been studying, and we'll get into that next. Thank you for being here. This is my first longer video. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good day.